The morning of her wedding, Eleanor stood at the chapel door in a gown that did not belong to her, and watched the rain decide whether it would fall. The lace at her wrists had been let out twice and still pulled tight across the bone. Somewhere behind her, in the cold stone nave, the organ practiced the same 4 notes. It had practiced for an hour, as if even the instrument could not believe what it was being asked to celebrate. She held her gloves in one hand because her fingers had gone too damp to wear them, and she looked across the gravel yard to the stable block, where a young man in a worn coat was leading a gray mare in slow circles to keep it calm. He did not look at her. He had not once looked at her in the 3 weeks she had been at Harrogate, and yet she knew, with the certainty that lived in her chest and not in her reason, exactly where he stood at every hour of the day. The bells had not yet rung. There was still time, the household said, for the bride to compose herself, though no one asked whether the bride wished to be composed or wished to run. To the parish she was already settled. To the dowager who had arranged it all, she was a debt being paid, in the only currency a ruined gentlewoman possessed. What none of them knew, what Eleanor herself had only begun to understand in the small hours of that morning, was that the man in the stable yard had a name she had not been told, and a reason for being there that had nothing to do with horses. This is the story of how a bride left her own wedding before the vows were spoken, and why the whole of the county would spend the winter arguing over whether she had been saved or ruined. Stay a while and decide for yourself. It began, as these things do, with a death and a ledger. Eleanor Vane was 23 years old, and until the spring of that year, she had been the only daughter of a gentleman of modest land and immodest hope. Her father had loved books more than rents and kindness, more than caution, and when the fever took him in a single week, it left behind a house with good bones and a desk full of papers that told a story he had never told her. There were debts. There were always debts, she came to learn, hiding behind the polite faces of country gentlemen. Hers was owed in large part to a neighbor named Mr. Den. Julian Crail, a man of new money and old grievance, who had lent her father sums against the estate, and who now held those papers. The way a cat holds a bird, it has not yet decided to eat. Mr. Gada. Crail was not cruel in the way of villains in stories. He was worse. In a quiet way. He was reasonable. He came to her in the first month of her mourning, sat in her father's chair without being asked, and explained that there was a solution that would spare her the indignity of being turned out. He would forgive the debt. He would keep the house in the family, as it were. He had only to make her his wife. He said it the way a man might offer to mend a fence, and when she did not answer at once, he smiled and told her to take her time, by which he meant that he would take the house if she did not. She had no mother to advise her. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 9, and all that remained of her was a folded letter and a primrose pressed flat between its pages, the yellow long faded to the color of old paper, the ink gone soft at the edges where Eleanor had read it too many times by candlelight. Her mother had written it to be opened on her wedding day, a foolish, tender thing, full of advice for a marriage her mother had imagined would be a happy one. She had decided she would open it only when she could do so without weeping, and that day had not come. So she came to Harrogate, the great cold house that Mr. Coldhouse Crail had bought from a family older and poorer than himself, to be married from the chapel his money had restored, by a vicar his money had obliged. She came with one trunk and her mother's letter, sewn into the lining of her cloak, and she was met at the door not by her intended, but by his mother, the Dowager Mrs. Boer. Crail, who had appointed herself the architect of the match and the keeper of its dignity, the dowager was a handsome woman of 60, who wore her certainties like jewels. She looked at Eleanor, the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has arrived from auction, assessing its condition, deciding where it would sit. "You are smaller than I expected," she said, "and paler. We shall have to do something about the paleness. My son does not care for an unhealthy look." She said it in the entrance hall where 2 footmen and a housekeeper could hear, and she said it pleasantly, and that was the first time Eleanor understood that her new life would be lived entirely in public, judged in passing, corrected in company. It was in the stable yard, on her second morning, that she first saw him. She had risen before the house, unable to sleep, and had walked out into the grey to be alone with the cold. The stables were the only place at Harrogate that smelled of something living. A young man was there before her in shirt-sleeves, despite the chill, rubbing down a horse with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who did the thing because it ought to be done well, and not because anyone watched. He was perhaps 30, tall and built for work, with dark hair too long for fashion, and a quiet to him that did not match his station. He looked up when her shoe scraped the cobbles. For a moment, only a moment, his eyes held hers, grey as the morning, and just as unreadable, and then he inclined his head a precise degree and returned to the horse, and she understood she had been seen and dismissed in the space of a breath, exactly as everyone at Harrogate saw and dismissed her. And yet he had not dismissed her. She did not know that yet. That is Thomas, the housekeeper told her later, when Eleanor asked, too carelessly, who tended the grey mare. "Come to us at midsummer." Keeps to himself. The mistress wished to turn him off, his manners being above his place, but the master would not have it. He has a way with the animals nobody can match. The housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Pike, lowered her voice though no one was near. "And he can read, miss. I have seen him with a book in the tack room. A stableman who reads. The mistress does not like it." Eleanor said nothing, but she carried the fact away with her, the way she carried all the small, strange facts of that house, and turned it over in the dark. The days at Harrogate had a shape, and the shape was designed to wear her smooth. There were fittings for the gown which the dowager supervised, finding fault. There were instructions in the running of a household she had not yet been given. There were dinners at which Mr. Crail spoke to his mother, and to the vicar, and to a cousin or two, and to Eleanor, only to ask whether she found the soup agreeable, as though her opinion of soup were the full extent of her usefulness. She learned to make herself quiet and small. She learned that quiet and small was what they wanted, and that wanting it, they would never trouble to learn anything more of her, and she found a bleak safety in that. The cousin in question was a young woman named Sophia Lark, the dowager's particular favorite, who had been brought to Harrogate, ostensibly to keep Eleanor company, and in truth, to remind everyone what a bride was supposed to look like. Miss Lark was golden and accomplished, and entirely confident of her own value, and she had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice for any room she entered. She was not unkind, exactly. She was simply unable to imagine that Eleanor's silence concealed anything worth hearing. "You must not mind the dowager," she told Eleanor once kindly, in the way of a person handing down charity. "She is only thinking of the family. A woman in your situation cannot expect to be courted. You know, you must be glad to be wanted at all." It was the second time the thing was said, though dressed now in sympathy instead of disdain, and Eleanor smiled and thanked her, and felt the words settle into the place where the others lived. What none of them saw, because none of them looked, was that Eleanor Vane had a will like a banked fire, and that she spent it carefully, on the only things at Harrogate that seemed to her worth the spending. There was a child in the house, a boy of 7, named Henry. The son of Mr. Crail's late sister, kept in the nursery wing and largely forgotten, brought down only when a guest wished to be charmed and then sent up again. He had a stammer that the dowager found tiresome, and a habit of hiding in the library that the dowager found worse. Eleanor found him there on her 4th day, wedged behind the long curtains with a book too heavy for his lap, and, instead of reporting him, she sat down on the floor beside him and asked him what he was reading, and waded through the stammer without finishing his words for him, which no one in that house had ever done. She went to the library every afternoon after that, and the boy came and she read to him, and he began slowly to read to her. It was the 1 hour of her day that belonged to no one's design. The room was vast and underused, its high shelves climbing into shadow, a single lamp lit against the early dark of autumn, and they made a small, warm island of it on the hearthrug. The boy with his finger tracking the lines, Eleanor wading through each caught syllable without ever once reaching to finish it for him. She did not know that the tall door at the end of the gallery, which gave onto a back stair the servants used, stood open a hand's width on those afternoons. She did not know that a man came up that stair with a book of his own, meaning to return it to the shelves, and stopped on the threshold when he heard a woman's voice reading low and patient through a child's halting answers, and that he stood there for the length of a chapter, unseen, one hand flat against the doorframe, and did not return his book, and went back down the stair more quietly than he had come. Thomas had not meant to watch her. He had meant to avoid her, as he avoided all of them, because he had come to Harrogate to be no one, and being no one required that he attend to nothing. Even so, he had stood at that door and watched a woman the house had decided was furniture sit on the floor in her plain gray gown and give a forgotten child the one thing the child had never been given, which was the patience to be heard. He had heard the boy reach a hard word and stop, the breath catching and catching, and he had braced himself for the impatience that always came, the finishing of the word, the small sigh, the lesson cut short. It had not come. She had simply waited, her voice steady, until the boy found the word, himself, and then she had told him he had read it well, and the boy had sat up straighter as though someone had set a crown on him. And something in Thomas that he had nailed shut a long time before came loose at the hinge. For Thomas was not a stableman. His name, the name he had not used in 2 years, was Thomas Avery. And he was by every law of the land the Earl of Westmere, master of an estate 3 counties distant, and he had taken work at Harrogate, under his Christian name alone, for reasons that belonged to the worst week of his life. He had had a younger brother, once Edmund, bright and reckless and beloved, who had wanted nothing in the world but a commission and a horse and a girl who would not have him. Thomas, newly come into the title, and frightened of the size of it, had refused him the commission, judging it too dangerous, judging himself wiser. Edmund had bought one anyway, with money borrowed from a man very like Mr. Second, Crail, and had died of a fever in a barracks before he ever saw a battle, and Thomas had buried him with the commission still in his coat pocket and the knowledge that his own caution had not saved his brother, but only set him at odds with the last person who loved him. He had not been able to bear the house after that, or the title, or the rooms that remembered Edmund. He had given the running of it to his steward and gone out into the country to be a man with hands and no name, to learn whether he was worth anything at all when his rank was taken away. He had chosen horses because Edmund had loved them. He had chosen Harrogate because it was far from anyone who knew his face. He had not chosen to fall in love. That had happened to him on a back stair against his will, and he had no idea what to do with it. If you have ever waited for someone to notice that you were more than the worst thing that had happened to you, then you already understand the next part of the story. Stay close. It turns slowly, but it turns. The thing about a quiet love is that it speaks in errands. Thomas could not court her. He could not so much as address her without breaching a wall that would have ended his disguise and her reputation both. So he did the only things a man in his position could do, and he did them so plainly that she did not see them for what they were. When she walked out in the cold mornings, a horse blanket appeared folded on the mounting block where she liked to sit, the wool warm and faintly rough and smelling of clean straw, and she thought a careless groom had left it, and was glad of it, and never once wondered why the same careless groom forgot it in the same exact place every single dawn. When the boy Henry developed a wish to learn to ride, it was Thomas who led the gentlest pony around the paddock at the boy's pace, slow as church, his hands steady on the bridle, and his voice pitched low. And even in a way the boy's stammer eased against, and he looked at no one but the child. While Eleanor watched from the rail and felt something in her chest she did not have a name for. She noticed that he never once let the pony's head come up too sharp, that he praised the boy for sitting straight, and said nothing of the times the boy clutched the mane, that he ended each lesson before the child grew tired or frightened. She told herself she was watching a man who was good with horses. She was watching a man who was good, and her body knew the difference before her mind would let her name it. When she came out one evening with her thin shawl drawn tight against a wind off the moor, he was suddenly there with a lantern she had not asked for, the light swinging gold across the wet cobbles, and he said, not gently, "Go inside." You will take a chill. It was an order. She heard the coldness in it, and not the care, because the wound she carried had taught her that no one's care would ever be for her, and she went inside, stung the warmth of the lantern still on the side of her face, and he stood in the dark and watched the lit window of her room appear, and then go dark. And he cursed himself for the only language he had left. He had spoken to men under his command in that voice once. He had learned, in the army of his own grief, that an order was a thing a man could give without breaking, that it kept the breaking on the inside, where no one could use it against him. And he did not know how to unlearn it, and so each kindness came out of him, shaped like a command, and each command drove her further off. And he saw it happen, and could not stop it. The dowager noticed, because dowagers notice. Not the truth, which was beyond her imagining, but the shape of an irregularity. "You spend a great deal of time at the stables," she said to Eleanor at dinner, the candlelight catching the diamonds at her throat. "It is not seemly. The grooms will talk. A bride 3 days from her wedding ought to be at her needlework, not loitering among the horses like a dairymaid." She let the word sit. Dairymaid. Across the table, Miss Lark pressed her napkin to her lips to hide a smile, and Mr. Plest. Crail said nothing at all, which was somehow the worst of it, and Eleanor felt her face go hot, and her hands go cold, and beneath the table her fingers found the seam of her cloak where her mother's letter was hidden, and held it, and said only, "Yes, ma'am," because there was nothing else to say that would not cost her more than she could pay. That night, she could not sleep. She took her candle down to the library, meaning to find a book to quiet her mind, and she found instead that she was not alone. Thomas was there, in the dark, returning a volume he had borrowed, and he froze when her light fell across him, caught somewhere he had no business being. They stood, the two of them, in the great cold room full of the smell of leather and dust, and for a long moment neither spoke, and the candle made his face into something carved and uncertain. Then he said low, "You should not be here at this hour," and she, who had been corrected all day by everyone who outranked her, who had swallowed dairymaid and worse, lifted her chin and said, "Neither I think should you. And yet, here we both are, where we should not be, reading books that are not ours." It was the first honest thing she had said in 3 weeks, and it surprised her as much as him. Something moved in his face. Almost a smile, gone before it formed. "What were you reading?" he asked, to the boy. "These afternoons," so he had heard. She felt the blood come up in her throat. "You listened," she said. "I did not mean to," he said, which was true, and then, which was truer, "I could not help it." The words hung between them far too large for the room, and he seemed to hear them only after they were spoken, and he stepped back as though the floor had moved. "Forgive me," he said, in the flat, hard voice he used for orders. "Go up. It is late." And she went, because she did not yet trust the thing rising in her own chest. But at the door she stopped and said without turning, "The boy has no one. You might have him taught to ride properly. After, when I am gone to the other wing, and cannot," it was the nearest she could come to asking him to be kind to the one creature she was leaving behind, and he understood it, and it undid him, and he did not answer, because he could not. The next 2 days she remembered ever after as a held breath. She moved through the fittings and the rehearsals and the dowager's corrections as through deep water. She told herself the thing she felt was nerves. She told herself a great many things. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that she had begun to listen for a particular footstep on the gravel and to feel the morning go gray and flat on the day she did not see him, because to tell herself that would have been to admit she was about to marry one man, while her whole body had turned, without her permission, toward another. And that admission would have been unbearable, since one man held the papers that would ruin her, and the other was a stableman with nothing to his name. On the eve of the wedding the dowager held a dinner, a long table of 22 covers laid with the good plate, the candles doubled in the dark windows, the talk running easy and loud among people who had never in their lives been told they were nothing. The thing was said for the 3rd time at that dinner, and this time it was said by Mr. Crail himself. A neighbor, deep in his wine, had ventured a clumsy compliment to the bride, something about how fortunate the lady was to be settled so well, and Mr. Bebius. Crail had set down his glass, and the small sharp click of the crystal on the cloth had pulled the table quiet by degrees, the way a stone dropped in a pond pulls the surface still, and he had said with the mild precision of a man stating a fact, "Fortune is the word. Miss Vane brings me nothing but the pleasure of charity. Her father's affairs were a ruin. I marry her to do a kindness, and to keep a good house from worse hands. Let us not pretend it is a love match. She knows her situation. She is grateful, are you not, Eleanor?" It was not a question. The table waited. Down its length she saw the faces turn to her one after another, the dowagers satisfied, Miss Lark's embarrassed, and dropping to her plate, the wine-flushed neighbor's reddening as he understood too late what he had set off, a maiden aunt's fan pausing mid-air, and she felt the whole machinery of the thing close over her head, and she said, "I know my situation, sir," in a voice that did not shake, and she did not say grateful, and only she knew the difference, and it was the last of her she had to give. She did not go to her room that night. She went out into the dark to the stables, past all seemliness because she could not breathe inside the house, and she found Thomas in the lantern light, sitting on an overturned pail with the gray mare's head over his shoulder, and a book open and unread on his knee, and he stood when he saw her, and did not tell her to go inside. She stood in the doorway with the cold at her back and the warm horse smell before her, and she said, "I am to be married in the morning." He said, "I know," she said. "He told the whole table tonight that he marries me out of charity. That I am grateful." Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated it. Thomas set down the book. He crossed the small space between them and stopped a careful arm's length away, close enough that she could see the muscle move in his jaw. The gray of his eyes gone dark, his hands held deliberately at his sides, as though he did not trust them. "You are not grateful," he said. "You are the only honest person in that house, and you have spent 3 weeks letting them believe you are nothing, because the truth costs more than you can spare. I have watched you do it. I have wanted to take a horsewhip to every one of them. I have no right to want anything where you are concerned, and I have wanted, since the first afternoon I heard you read, only to stand between you and all of it." He stopped, appalled at himself, breathing hard. It was the most words she had ever heard him speak, and every one of them was a thing she had needed her whole life to hear, and never thought to hear from a man who mucked stalls. "You should not say such things to me," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "I should not," but he did not take them back. The lantern hissed. Somewhere the mare shifted its weight. Eleanor became aware of her own heartbeat in her throat, of the half-step that would close the distance between them, of his breath, and her breath, and the unbearable narrow space of air the propriety and circumstance had filled with stone. She did not cross it. He did not cross it. They stood in the not-crossing, which was its own kind of touch, until she made herself step back into the cold. "Good night, Thomas," she said. "Good night, Miss Vane," he said, and the way he said her name, with a grief in it like a man saying goodbye to something he had only just been given, followed her all the way back to the house and into a bed where she did not sleep. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that an hour after she left him, Thomas saddled the gray mare in the dark and rode through the night to the nearest town, where a man he had written to a week before was waiting at an inn with a leather case of papers, and that the worst week of his life had, without his quite intending it, begun 2 years before to prepare him for this one. Morning came, gray and undecided, the rain holding off, the bells silent and waiting. They dressed her in the gown that did not fit. The dowager came to inspect her and pronounced her passable, and pinched some color into her cheeks with her own cold fingers, and Eleanor stood at the chapel door at the edge of the gravel yard and looked across at the stable block where a young man in a worn coat was leading the gray mare in slow circles, and she felt for one moment that her heart would simply stop and spare her the rest. And then the bells began. They had got her halfway down the aisle. She remembered it ever after in pieces, the cold of the stone through her thin slippers, the vicar's face arranged into solemnity, Mr. Patcher, Crail waiting at the rail in a coat, the color of a closed door, the dowager in the front pew with her chin lifted, and the diamonds hard at her throat, Miss Lark beside her in the pale blue of a girl who knew she would have looked better there. Eleanor walked toward it because there was nothing else her body knew how to do. She had got as far as the third pew when the chapel door at the back opened, not flung but pushed, firmly, and a man walked in, and the whole congregation turned, because the man who walked in was the stableman, and the stableman had no business in that chapel. And yet he came out the aisle behind her with the unhurried certainty of someone who had every right to be there, and the certainty was so complete that no one moved to stop him. He did not raise his voice. That was the thing the county argued over all winter, that he did not shout, did not rave, did not make a scene in the way scenes are made. He stopped a few feet from her, in the center of the aisle between the bride and the altar. And into the great frozen silence of that chapel he said, plainly, "Eleanor, do not marry this man." It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed in the silence like a stone in still water, and the rings of it went out and out. The vicar's mouth opened and shut. "Mr. Spurd." Crail took a step forward, his composure cracking into something ugly. "Who," said the dowager, rising, "is this person? And why is a groom permitted to interrupt my son's wedding?" She turned to the footman. "Remove him." The footman did not move, because the stableman had reached into his coat and brought out a folded paper bearing a seal that even from the pews could be seen to be no common thing, and he handed it not to the dowager but to the vicar, and he said, still without raising his voice, "My name is Thomas Avery. I am the Earl of Westmere. That document confirms it, and confirms also that the debts of the late Mr. Vane, which this gentleman holds over his daughter, were purchased in full 3 days ago by my steward, and are discharged. Miss Vane owes Mr. Crail nothing. She is free to marry, or not to marry, as she chooses, and the choice is hers alone, and it always should have been. It is difficult to describe what a room does when its certainties are taken from it, all at once. The dowager sat down without meaning to Mr. Conger. Crail looked at the paper in the vicar's shaking hands, and his reasonable face came apart, because a reasonable man's whole power lies in his being the only one in the room who knows the figures. And the figures had just been taken from him. Miss Lark stared at the stableman, who was an earl, with an expression that was, for the first time in her gilded life, entirely without a script. And Eleanor stood in the middle of it all in her borrowed gown and understood, slowly. And then all at once, every folded blanket and every lantern and every order to go inside out of the cold. And she put her hand to her mouth, and the sound she made was not a sob, but something older and more like relief. He turned to her then, and the whole chapel was forgotten. "I had no right," he said, low, only to her, though the room heard every word. "I have less to offer you than you think. I am a man who failed his brother and ran from his own name for 2 years because he could not bear it. I came here to be no one. And then I heard you read to a child no one wanted, and I remembered what it was to want to be worth something. I cannot tell you to choose me. I have not earned that. I could not, however, stand in that yard one more morning and watch them hand you to a man who calls your worth charity. So I am asking you nothing. I am only telling you that you are free. What you do with it is yours." She looked at him. She looked at Mr. Crail, at the dowager, at the vicar, at the whole cold machinery that had decided what she was. And then she did the thing the county would argue over. Until spring. She crossed the small space she had not crossed in the stable, the space propriety had filled with stone, and she put her hand on his arm, and she said, in a voice that carried clear to the back of the chapel, "Then I choose to walk out of here on the arm of the only man who ever asked me what I was reading." They walked out together, down the aisle, past the broken composure of Mr. Seber, Crail and the toppled certainty of the dowager and the wide eyes of the rival who had no script, and the great chapel door stood open on a yard where the rain had finally decided not to fall, and the gray mare waited, and a forgotten boy named Henry, who had crept down from the nursery to see. stood at the rail in the thin sun with his whole small face alight, and Eleanor stopped and held out her hand to him, because she did not mean to leave him behind. And Thomas understood, and lifted the child up, and the three of them went out into the morning together while the bells, confused, fell silent. The county did argue, and Neller, it argued that autumn and into the winter, in drawing rooms and over cards, whether the vain girl had been delivered or had thrown herself away, whether an earl who plays at being a stableman is mad or merely grieving, whether the dowager would ever again arrange anything. Mr. Crail left for town, and was not much missed. The dowager, who was not a fool, did the one wise thing of her life and held her tongue, and in time was even heard to say that she had always thought there was more to the girl than she let on, which was not true, but which cost her less than the truth would have. Miss Lark married a baronet within the year, and was content, and learned, slowly, that being the correct choice in every room is a colder thing than being chosen in one. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the chapel of Westmere, with the boy Henry as the only attendant, because Thomas had asked for the child to come and Eleanor had not had to be asked. There was no crowd to render a verdict. There was a fire in the great hearth of a house that had been shut up too long, and the windows had been thrown open to let the cold dead air of grief out, and the green spring in, and the rooms that had remembered a dead brother began, slowly, to learn to remember other things. On the morning of that wedding, Eleanor sat by the window in the early light, and at last unsewed the seam of her old gray cloak, and took out the letter she had carried so long, the folded letter with the pressed primrose flat between its pages, the yellow faded to the color of old paper. She had told herself once that she would open it only when she could do so without weeping. She found, that morning, that she still wept, but that the weeping had changed its nature entirely, and that this, she thought, was perhaps what her mother had meant. Her mother had written in a hand that grew lighter toward the end of the page, as though the writing had cost her, and she had written of small, ordinary things, of choosing a husband who asked questions and listened to the answers, of keeping one room in the house that was wholly her own, of not mistaking a loud man for a strong one. She had written that a marriage is made, not on the wedding day, but on 10,000 gray mornings after it, and that Eleanor must marry a man she could bear to take breakfast with for 40 years. Eleanor read it and thought of a lantern in a wet yard and a blanket folded on a mounting block, and she understood that her mother, dead these 14 years, had described to her exactly the man waiting downstairs, and for the first time the letter did not read as a wound, but as a blessing, arriving late and arriving still. She pressed the primrose flat again between the pages and laid the letter in the small box where she meant to keep it, and she rose and went down to be married to the man who had asked her what she was reading. That evening, when the small ceremony was done and the boy had been put to bed in a room that was his now and would always be, with the gentlest pony promised to him for the morning, Thomas found her at the window of the long gallery, watching the last light go off the hills. He came and stood beside her, not an arm's length away as he had stood in the stable, but close, his shoulder against hers, a thing they had earned the right to. Below them in the paddock the gray mare moved through the dusk, unhurried, cropping the new grass, and somewhere in the house a fire settled in its grate. "I have something to confess," he said. She looked up at him. "You ran away from an earldom to shovel manure," she said. "I think you have confessed enough for one lifetime." Almost, his mouth curved. Then it did. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, the grave carved stillness of his face breaking open into something younger and unguarded. And it was, she decided, a thing worth the 3 weeks and the 2 years and the whole cold winter of the county's arguing, all of it, to have brought into the world. On the sill between them lay the letter with the primrose pressed inside it, and outside the open window the spring came on, green and unhurried, over a house that had decided, at last, to live. If Eleanor's journey stayed with you, stay a moment longer in it before you go, and carry it kindly into your own evening. The bride had left her wedding, the county said, on the arm of a stableman. She had in truth left it on the arm of a man who had been brave enough to be no one until he could be brave enough to be himself. and she had walked out of one cold house and into the warm rooms of her own, at last. And that, whatever the county decided, was the whole of the truth of it.